essentially have become part of the city's approval process, in a sense, right? Is that they're actually the higher authority than the cities? Is
that's correct? In that way, they're almost acting as like a super zoning board that's sitting above these local governments. But more concerning is the fact that they're reinterpreting long-standing ordinances and coming to a different conclusion than those which have been relied upon by people within the area for sometimes decades. And there is a process to change these sort of land use ordinances, but that involves submitting new amendments and having them approved by the Board of Supervisors or City Council and then submitted to the Commission for approval. When they're taking on these cases and announcing a new policy without going through that process, they're effectively acting as a kind of quasi-legislature.
So they make their rules. In that example, other people would not apply with the basement anymore, right?
That's correct.
That's what they're saying.
The Commission gained a new power, and that's the power to directly fine. In 2014, what was added is the ability to fine for any violation of public access. So essentially, if the Commission determines that someone interfered with the ability of the public to access the coast, then they could fine them up to $11,250 per day. So that's a tremendous potential penalty power. As of 2022, that power has now been expanded, and they have the ability to fine $11,250 per day for any violation of the Coastal Act. And it's important to note that now that they no longer have to go before an independent judge, this is a power that they can essentially unilaterally impose.
Have you seen them fine somebody?
Yes. The first example of the penalty power that took place, so the first time that the Commission wielded this tremendous power, they fined a couple in Malibu $4.185 million.
Wow.
And the supposed violation in that instance was a gate that had existed over what was a public easement that was held by the Coastal Conservancy. So a public easement that had been granted to the state in the early 80s by the predecessor owners.
And easement is actually letting somebody get through, letting the state get through.
Precisely. An easement, if it were developed, would allow individuals to walk from the street down to the beach. Now, despite the fact that the state had held this easement for approximately 40 years, in that time they had never taken any steps to develop it. And in fact, from the street level, the gate was protecting people from falling 6 feet onto a concrete drain pipe. So even if that gate had been removed, there was no actual access that could have taken place. After the Commission imposed its nearly $4.2 million penalty on the Lents, the owners of the house, the Lents agreed to remove the gate, but the Commission actually asked them to wait a few months until they could make sure to put up a replacement gate. So to this day, a gate is still in place across this easement because the state has never undertaken the steps to actually develop access down to the beach. But again, with virtually no due process protections, with a very minimal one-day hearing that constituted approximately 45 minutes, the Commission was able to impose a crushing civil penalty on two landowners who, at best, had merely failed to remove a gate that they weren't certain needed to be removed, and even if it were removed, constituted a public hazard.
Remove it? Is that?
Well, the important thing to note is that there's virtually none of the protections that an individual would get by right in a court of law. So you have no opportunity to cross-examine witnesses. You have no ability to subpoena witnesses or information. You have no ability to require that people testify under oath. And in fact, the people who do testify might be free to engage in hearsay or pure speculation, things that, again, would not be considered evidence in any other court of law. And oftentimes there's no ability for the individual to respond to the testimony that is given. And, for example, in the hearing by the, for example.
So essentially they can fine people and decide how much they're going to fine them and use the money themselves.
That's correct. So oftentimes, and even in the case of the Lents hearing and in other hearings, they talked quite a bit about how those funds might be used. If we impose this large penalty, maybe that will help to then develop the access point that over the last 40 years we've never developed. So the Commission sees this as a very large revenue generation tool and something that can offset other perceived budget shortfalls.
What about the people that are getting fined? What do they think of them? Because the Commission is finding these people. Are they looking at them and saying, okay, they have the money to pay, or how do they look at these people?
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up, because for some individuals that may be a factor on whether or not say a fine is excessive. But that's not necessarily something that the Commission has to look into. That's something that then hopefully a court would review and determine whether or not those fines are excessive under the U.S. Constitution. But even that large of a penalty has been approved of by the California courts, and I think that should terrify any other individual.
And the fence was still there after the penalty?
So the original fence was removed, but a new one was put up and remains in place to this day, because again, the state has still not in any way developed the access point that might actually allow people to get down to the beach.
So they just actually find this person without really doing.
That's correct. And if Californians want more public lands along the coastline, and those lands are currently owned by private individuals, there's a very easy and constitutional way to obtain that land, which is through eminent domain, which allows you to take that property for the public use and pay the landowner reasonable, just compensation. And instead, what the Coastal Commission has often done is obtained these untouched resources, but at the expense of a private landowner and who is not getting the just compensation that they should be constitutionally entitled to.
Now, Jeremy, do you have any other thoughts for our audience?
I think the important thing for individuals to know is that it's not either or when it comes to property rights and coastal preservation. Like I said, there's tons of opportunities for private landowners and local governments to work together and to ensure that our coastlines remain beautiful and available for all the public. The only mechanism doesn't have to be an overbearing group of unelected officials who are sitting over every single permit decision along the coastline and oftentimes acting in ways that appear arbitrary.
Jeremy Talcott, attorney at Pacific Legal Foundation. It was great to have you on California Insider.
Thank you for having me.
That was why California can't build more desalination plants with Jeremy Talcott. The corruption by the Confederate insurgents, the systems in place are specifically extortionary to replace the American Republic and the nation of law with the criminal Confederacy for the maintenance and distribution of the criminal enterprises in Confederate terrorism. The systems of Iran-Contra by the mechanisms from the president at the time, Reagan, was systematically put in place, which allows them the advantage to profit off of the sales and distributions of black market properties, at which point the position is the chaotic market of the criminal function, which requires the law enforcement against the product in order to increase the value of the product, in order to acquire a larger resource, in order to fund their black budgets, which do not account for all of the money that the legislator has provided to them. This is an excessive to the power of the purse function, which generates consistent extortion from crime, including the use of framing people, which allows them to sell the product, and at which point they can protect the person from acquiring the remedy to their Confederate secret. At which point, with the barring of the secret, you have the protected crime market, which is a function that subverts the spirit of the law, and which is aiding and abetting by the funding and supplying and supporting of enemy terrorists to the rule of law nation and the popular government the nation of law as the constitutional republic, which is the rule of law over the popular government, is the function being specifically subverted by treason, sedition, and high crimes from these criminal insurgents, which are generating these subversions through Confederate parallel parasitic attacks against the United States. Now, these secrets are not secrets to America's enemies. America's enemies and people in other countries around the world, they all know about these procedures. They've been happening for a long time, and they aren't really going to be advantaged or disadvantaged by the knowledge they already possess. The American people are the target of these subjects. The barring of American justice, the overthrowing of checks and balances, the seizing of the co-equal branches in order to bar the legislature and bar the judiciary from exceeding the Confederacy, at which point the Americans inside the executive cannot counter the Confederacy, and the Americans in the judiciary and the legislature are not allowed to counter the Confederacy, as they are a parasite preemptively attacking American loyalists in the government, which is systematic espionage war for Klan functions, generating the system of destabilized order and economic terrorism, which is the function of wizard communism, which allows for the centrally planned schedule of the American economy against the free market. And as they are criminal actions, the estimate of why they hate David as a character is based upon his intelligence oversight function defeating their criminal subversions, as their purpose in the genocide includes the erasing of intelligence oversight functions from that branch, which would have systematically removed these criminal advantages of the double agents seeking the destruction of the civilian government. The estimate for that function includes the intelligence oversight discovering their wizard communist plans for the economy, which is not a free market, and thus it is determinably true that those sales would happen according to the function as they are enforced by Confederate intention, and as they are not a part of the free market, trading off of them is not insider trading, as it is a criminal action being subverted. And then David's network, using the brokerage contracts with the federal government, would then be able to distribute the civilian remedy to the economic terrorism destabilizing the American economy, allowing for the mechanisms specifically necessary in order to correct against their finalized educated criminal intention, which they have confessed to government, which is barred from due process as they are not Americans. They are obstructing the delivery to their superior office, which is an act of sedition. The barring of a superior agent from conducting a lawful function of government is an act of sedition. And as these are criminal functions against the United States, everyone who's validated them has put America last, as supporting Confederate terrorism in the war on terror makes them an enemy of war to the United States government. As an enemy combatant to the United States government, military protocols legally are compelled to be used against them by anyone loyal to the United States inside the military for the immediate arrest and disillusionment of the public threat. Which again is why they targeted David's branch, in order to prevent the function of the enforcement of American loyalties against Confederate terrorisms, at which point you have the systems in place that don't advantage America at all and are systematically designed to injure America and reshape the United States economy into the image and desire of its most degenerate enemies in history, at which point you have the system in place of complete chaos, which includes their terrorisms against the black communities historically, which they have been abusing from Confederate interests for years and decades and millennia and however long they've been doing it. The fact that it is a secret qualifies the action that it is not determinable by dependable dates, and by the obstruction of the dates on people and etc., they generate the plausible deniability that their crime wasn't a crime, but in reality was the mechanism, at which point the fact that the Klan is wearing Klan uniforms, the KKK outfits, the bed sheets and the hood would be generated in order to disguise as plausible deniability that the falsely perceived trustable members of society are in fact not trustable members of society, subverting the civil order becomes the mechanism which is a threat to the American public as a function that subverts the spirit of law is in fact void as fraud. A custom without reason is void. These base mechanisms, subverting color of law and color of office, are actively being blocked by those seeking to destroy the United States through these criminal functions of espionage wars, creating Confederate systematic application of policy as a replacement to the American policies, which are criminally obstructed by their voter frauds and their terrorisms through their fake plausible deniability schemes, which is specifically designed to promote these types of functions, such as the Manchurian Candidate, which generates their ability to coerce government officials into compliance, such as 7 ways of Sunday of the intelligence agencies to get back at people who don't agree with them, such as Chuck Schumer's comment to Donald Trump, which is the statement that the intelligence agencies are not loyal to the president. And since the intelligence agencies aren't loyal to the president, you understand that they are not in practice functioning as American, as the president is the chief executive over all executive functions, and the existence of the intelligence function is subordinate to the executive branch, at which point the subversion of their superior is an act of treason, sedition, and high crimes, which has been conducted for long times preceding, such as their war on David and their systematic removal of the checks and balances structure for law and order, which would have barred their criminal subversions of American interests against the centralized powers without law and loyal to the functional criminal systems, at which point you have the function of creating a feudalist structure with multiple factions which are systematically engaging in party over law, which is the system of them constantly conducting and fighting. As insurgency divides infinitely, they are always going to seek to purge each other as outsiders until finally you only have their one singular preferred race inside the structure, as they would have eradicated all other mechanisms, similar to the Nazi strategy when Hitler took over Germany, at which point the protection of voter fraud by the executive terrorists, such as the brown shirts hired by Hitler in order to engage in intimidations and threats and violence for the political position, creates substantive changes to the vote, which changes the substantive outcome of each of the elections, which must be held in contempt as fraud, generating the obligation for law enforcement to bar these practices and engage in the full correction under legal precedents without any subversion to the correct procedure, making all corrections against any violations of those procedures with the appropriate punishments and fines generates the obligation for us to restart. Now, the systems of some people, such as the character Joe, have suggested that you can't restart elections because if everyone's cheating, then everyone's disqualified, and then you have to go all the way down to like 19th or 17th place before you can find uncheating candidates, which is irrelevant and fraudulent, as the disqualified are disqualified, and the act of disqualifying means they were never legally allowed on the ballot. The action of purging them from the ballot restarts the voting procedure from scratch without the felons engaged in the voter fraud. And without the criminals, you can have a legal vote, and thus there are no cheaters once you've done the structure correctly. And I think the function of the character Joe is quoting that was citing a parallel structure to, I think it was bodybuilders do on steroids. And if you have a bunch of bodybuilders doing steroids and steroids are prohibited, then you can't really get a fair verdict on the contest because you have all of these cheaters. At which point, that function is a different complication which doesn't apply to the American electoral system, as that being apples to oranges, it is irrelevant. The voting procedure disbars the criminal and then restarts the voting procedure. Would be the correct remedy to that function.
Readily identifiable as being an Alameda-associated account. This, in plain terms, seems like fraud. Now, the CFTC charged Bankman-Fried with violating Section 6C of the Commodities Exchange Act, which is basically patterned after Rule 10b of the Securities Exchange Act. The law is a broad sort of catch-all provision that prohibits fraud in all of its forms, and the law prohibits manipulative and deceptive devices and contrivances in connection with any swap or contract and basically anything in relation to the sale of a commodity. Now, the newest amendments to the law were added in 2010 by the Dodd-Frank Act, which make it easier for the CFTC to charge fraud because the government no longer has to prove that a defendant specifically intended to create a price trend that was manipulative. Now, the CFTC can charge anyone who uses manipulative or deceptive devices is intentionally reckless in conduct that's intended to create or did create an artificial price. Now, that takes us to the criminal indictment from the Department of Justice. The U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York, which handles a lot of financial crimes because New York City is within the Southern District of New York, and they obtained an indictment against Bankman-Fried for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, conspiracy to commit commodities fraud, conspiracy to commit securities fraud, conspiracy to commit money laundering, and conspiracy to defraud the Federal Election Commission and commit campaign finance violations. Now, we kicked off our first video about Bankman-Fried by discussing the possibility of wire fraud, and what do you know? It was wire fraud. Wire fraud specifically involves the use of telecommunications or online communications, including emails, social media, text messages, or even good old-fashioned fax machines. The unsealed indictment says that starting in 2019 and continuing until November of 2022, Bankman-Fried committed wire fraud. Now, this might not have come as a complete shock to Bankman-Fried because, according to the Australian website Financial Review, Bankman-Fried and his FTX and Alameda associates had a secret chat group called cryptically Wire Fraud. The group exchanged secret messages on Signal about the potential for U.S. wire fraud charges for their role in the implosion of FTX and Alameda Research. In response to the allegation, Bankman-Fried tweeted, "If this is true, then I wasn't a member of that inner circle. I'm quite sure it's just false. I have never heard of such a group." Though, on the other hand, maybe he just wanted to save the Department of Justice a whole bunch of money and making it super easy to prosecute him and everyone that he worked with. And as I mentioned, the government also criminally charged Bankman-Fried with various species of conspiracy to commit wire fraud, securities fraud, commodities fraud, money laundering, and campaign finance violations. And regarding that last charge, prosecutors said that Bankman-Fried misappropriated tens of millions of dollars of customer funds to make illegal donations to both Democratic and Republican candidates. So the question is, if Bankman-Fried is convicted, how long is he going to jail? Well, the CFTC and the SEC filed civil complaints seeking monetary damages and injunctive relief to prevent Bankman-Fried from being near a corporation or a company ever again. Now, the fines could be enormous in this case, but it'll probably take a long time to resolve, with potentially years of discovery and a string of bankruptcies to sort things through. The criminal case filed by the Department of Justice will go much faster. Now, Bankman-Fried was indicted for a number of different federal felonies, some of which meld into each other, but some are separate counts. And unlike the CFTC and the SEC complaints, if the DOJ convicts, Sam Bankman-Fried could be looking at a long sentence. The amount of time he gets depends on two things: the offenses of conviction and the federal sentencing guidelines. The sentencing guidelines provide 43 levels of offense seriousness. The more serious the crime, the higher the offense level. And each type of crime is assigned a base offense level, which is the starting point for determining the seriousness of the particular offense. Now, Bankman-Fried is not a prior offender, which would normally reduce the sentence, but the nature of his crimes is serious, and there are at least three different groups of victims here: lenders, creditors, customers, and the United States government. Now, wire fraud carries a maximum prison sentence of up to 20 years, and if the wire fraud involves over $550 million, which is possible if not likely here, then Bankman-Fried could get a maximum sentence, even without a prior criminal history. Securities fraud carries a maximum sentence of up to 25 years in prison and a fine that is based on the amount of money that was fraudulently obtained, which here was a lot. And a conviction for money laundering could result in a sentence of up to 20 years and a big fine. So if we look at it conservatively, assuming the government proves some but not all of the charges, Bankman-Fried could get a sentence of 10 to 15 years. There's still a lot of things that we don't know since the case is still in its very early stages, and it could be a lot more than that. Now, maybe the strangest story related to SBF's arrest is that his family reportedly called the prison to request vegan meals. Now, that's not going to happen. But
that was SBF is going to jail for a long time by Legal Eagle. The function of FTX has engaged in funding from Ukraine, which is derived by Ukraine receiving arms from the United States legislature, which have legislated the delivery of military equipment, which has been resold in many cases in order to engage in the liquidation of many assets in order to fund many of the corruption and the black books, which might very well include covering some debt liabilities generated by previous loans provided by the Western world to them, which generates these types of arrangements, which is funneled into the FTX mechanism, as some of the records that I've reviewed looked like Ukraine was one of the founder functions of the systematic fraud, which is a direct reaction of intention constructed by the original legislator and executives who designed the proxy war against the Russians, at which point they had been arranging for these criminal operations for an extensive period of time. Since David was a small child, they had already cemented long-term plans in order to engage in these criminal operations, including the wizard communism generating these illegal functions, at which point they are an extension of the unitary executive theory's criminal subversion of the United States stability, generating threats against American interests at home and abroad, at which point you have the systematic insurrection generated by the consistent application of these criminal money or revenue generators, which systematically destabilizes the American public, as they are fundamentally criminal extortion rackets, which systematically, as applied wizard communism, determines the predetermined market by criminal intent submitted to the government, which is separate to the function of the free market, and thus the conviction and subversion of it would be separate to any insider trading accusation. As another example, Richard D. Wolff, Why Capitalism Must Be Destroyed, when referring to the wizard communism effects in previous decades' markets.
From the 71% top income tax bracket on individuals in 1970, it's 39% now. Wow. Corporate profits are taxed at the lowest rate in many, many decades. Wonderful. Regulations removed. Privatization, sell everything. Instead of the post office, we can have FedEx. Wonderful. All of which was spoken that would liberate our economy. What? What? Again, the history. In the 1950s and 60s, the top income tax bracket was in the 90%. We had lower unemployment and faster economic growth than we have now. The story is not we cut taxes on corporations and they really boosted. We cut taxes on corporation and we went in the toilet as an economy. Our growth is slow. 2014, our growth, averaged over the whole year, is 2.5%. Economic growth in the People's Republic of China, 7.5%. It's been that way for 20 years. That's why China is now the second economy in the world. They've been growing very fast. They don't have free enterprise, poor folk. They don't have it. The government takes a heavy hand. And boy, does it pay off for them. I'm not arguing that we should be Chinese people or have their economy, but face the reality. We have run an economy in the interest of returning wealth to the rich and the corporations. Every statistic shows it. The top 10%, I know these numbers sometimes get blurry, but they're not complicated. The top 10% of Americans own 90% of the wealth. The other 90% share the other 10%. Got it? It's exact inverse. 10% own 90% of the world, of the wealth in this country. And the other 90% of us share the other 10%. The United States used to like to make fun of certain countries, particularly in Latin America, as, quote, banana republics because of this lopsided distribution.